Hi friends, it's Lisa Hetrick, illustrator for Gina K Designs, and I'm so grateful you could join me today. I have a really fun card project that I'm going to be sharing with you today that's chock full of watercolor techniques, and I'm going to be using my brand new stamp set with Gina K Designs called Just a Little. And here are two samples that I have shared on my blog, but I'm going to recreate it today in the video, and we're going to do a couple different wet on wet watercolor techniques using gouache paint and using Gina K Designs dye-based inks. It's going to be super fun, so let's go ahead and get started. We're going to get started by sharing the supplies that I'm going to be using to make the project. I have two brushes here, an 8 and a 10 round. These are from the Silver line, black velvet brushes. I love using these for watercolor. They hold a lot of water and they hold a lot of color, but you could use any brush that you prefer. I have two white paint pens here, a Uniball Signo, and I have a Posca, which I absolutely love. These are great whites to work on top of watercolor. And I also have my favorite black ink on the whole entire planet, the Gina K Designs Amalgam ink. And this is perfect for watercoloring. I have two different mediums here. I have 4 colors here of the Gina K Designs Premium Dye ink. And I also have 4 colors in the Arteza Gouache Paint. Now, this is a new to me brand and a new to me paint, so I'm giving it a go. And I'll talk about it a little bit more along the way. I'm also using my brand new stamp set, Just a Little. We're going to be using that main floral image that's perfect, large, and big for the corner. And we're also going to be using the stripe. I'm also sharing here my favorite watercolor paper for Papercrafting, and that's from B Paper Company, and I'll have that all linked up in the bottom of the video for you as well. I have a piece of Gina K Designs black onyx cardstock cut to an A2 size, so that's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And I just love, you see me do a lot of cards, and I'm always using black cardstock because it pops really well with all the color work that I'm doing. Okay, so let's get started on stamping the main image, and I'm going to be using the Misty here because I'm inking it up with the amalgam ink, and even though the amalgam ink is super, super, super black and a really, really dense ink, when you're using it on watercolor paper, you do need to do it like 2 or 3 times because the watercolor paper does absorb a lot of the color. And if you want a really, really nice solid, you just need to break out the Misty and use the ink 2 or 3 times. So I'm going to go ahead and ink this up 3 times to get this corner image. And my Misty is a little bit dirty and I've got ink everywhere, but it's okay. I really love using the Misty to reapply the ink over and over and over again. And I just flipped everything around and I did the corner at the top as well. And you can see I'm leaving this space between, in sort of like in the upper third, so that we can get the sentiment in there and I can get the stripe in there. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to inking up the stripe background. I'm only going to be using one of the stripes. So I'm going to ink it up with the Turquoise Sea. And I want to use one of the stripes, the stripe in the middle, because that will be the grounding image to hold the sentiment because. So I just went ahead and cleaned it off. I do have a little bit of residual ink on here, and that's okay because this is a watercolor project and we're probably going to get a little bit of inky stuff in places that we don't want it to be, but that's okay. So I went ahead and inked it up with the Turquoise Sea from Gina K Designs and inked up that middle stripe. And I'm using my tidy towel here to just kind of wipe away the other ink that I don't want to stamp. Now, the stamp is going to be wet, and when I ink it, when I stamp it down, a little bit of residual ink from using the stamp on other projects is going to show up, but that's okay. So I'm using a little mister of water and I'm just misting the stripe to just activate the dye ink so that it'll give me that watercolor look and feel that I'm looking for. And I'm going to go ahead and stamp down that stripe right there in between where the two florals are meeting. So you can see that there's a little bit of yellow there, and there's a little bit of striping from the top and the bottom. That's okay, because when we're done with the watercolor, it's just going to blend in so nicely. Okay, so I have two colors here in gouache paint. I have a pink and I have an orange, and I'm also sharing, you could use the Tangerine Twist or Passionate Pink from the Gina K Designs line to do this technique as well. So if you don't have paint or watercolor or gouache paint, you could use the dye inks to replicate this look and feel. So I just took a little bit of that paint and put it down on my mat here, and I'm getting my round brush nice and juicy and wet. And here is one of the questions I get all the time. Watercolor and watercolor mediums are kind of scary to some because they're rogue. They go wherever the water is. So the more wet your project is, the more your paint is going to distribute. And that's the effect that I'm looking for here on this project, because we're not really going for precision. We're really just going for a nice little watercolor washy look. And using the gouache paint and watering it down, I can get those watercolor effects. But I'm also going to be able to do a lot of layering so that I can create a more opaque look when we're finished. So you can see that I'm using my number 10 brush and just applying water first. So I applied water to the whole stamped area, and then I've gone in and I'm just adding color. So I start with the pink, and then I'm adding a little bit of the gamboge, which is like a yellow orange, and then I'm adding a little bit of pink back in. And this whole process here is wet. So this paper is completely saturated with color, and it's allowing me to just continue to add color on top of color on top of color, and the color is just pooling up and spreading wherever the water is. So I'm just going and I'm going out a little bit to the outer areas of the flower and adding a little bit of that color and just kind of dragging the color along. And in between, I just went ahead and dried it using a heat tool and just dried it. So that's the key with watercolor. If you want to add layers on top of layers with watercolor, you need to dry your project in between. So once I finished the succulent florals in the lower left-hand corner and the upper, I went ahead and just used the heat tool and then dried the whole piece of watercolor so that it was completely bone dry. Now going back in here with the green, again, doing that wet on wet, adding a lot of water to that area first, and then dropping in the color into the feather-like image here and into the florals outside of the floral. So again, just keeping this nice and wet, and I have a little paper towel where if it gets too wet, I'm just kind of dabbing it off and taking a little bit of away. But you can see that this is a very playful way to paint, and it's also not based on perfection or precision, which I absolutely love. Okay, so I cleaned up my area a little bit, and I also dried off took the heat tool to the piece of watercolor paper and dried that layer again. So I'm going back in with this pink, which is a lot like opera pink, so it's got like a neon quality to it. And I'm adding more color on top of the dry piece of watercolor paper. So you can see that the color is starting to get deeper and richer, and it's getting like more enhanced. It's popping. So by doing this also with gouache paint, you are going to get more opaque looks in those areas. So you can see that it's still kind of translucent, but we're starting to get more dense color, and when it dries, it's really going to look really super opaque. Okay, so this is like the third time I'm going in after I've dried everything, and I'm going in with those pinks again so that I can get more intense pink. So now it's time to get the sentiment in here while everything else is kind of drying. So I've got the word just on the Misty here, and I'm going to apply amalgam ink either 2 or 3 times to the watercolor paper so that I can get a really, really nice dense black on this watercolor paper. And you can see that the just is just kind of positioned right above that watercolor stripe that we created, giving me a nice position to be able to put in the word because. Now you could put in the other sentiments as well because there's plenty of space here to do just a little note or just a thank you. So there's lots of different things that you could do here. And I think that that stripe feature with the watercolor really nests that word really, really nicely and kind of grounds that whole sentiment there. So now it's time to add a little bit of splatter with the paint onto the whole watercolor piece. Now I took the turquoise sea and just kind of mashed it down onto my craft mat and added a little bit of water. Now when you're using the dye-based inks and you're using them as a watercolor medium, you just need to make sure that they're really, really wet down. So just add a lot of water, get it into your brush, and you can tap it down and you can get these really great splatter looks. So I'm going to go ahead and trim this whole piece down just a little bit. So I use this trimmer to just kind of cut little shards off of each end because the original piece of watercolor paper was cut to an A2 and so is my card. So I really want to trim this down so that it fits right onto the piece of cardstock, and I went ahead and adhered that. Just adding a little bit of these turquoise Nouveau drops to just kind of bring that turquoise color in, and really simple, low profile. There's a sample of the other card that I use with watercolor, and you can really, really see how that gouache paint kind of pops, and it's a lot more opaque. And it's just a different kind of watercolor medium. So here's a look at the final card where I added a lot more detail with the white pens just to kind of make those pinks and those turquoise colors pop a little bit more. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.